Hi, I'm Mary Elizabeth Williams. Welcome to Patient. My guest today, I am so excited to talk to you. This is Dr. Melissa Red Hoffman. She is a trauma surgeon and a hospice doctor. She's also a TEDx speaker. I'm going to link to it below, but you're going to be blown away by her TEDx talk from a couple of years ago. And she's a writer. We found each other on Substack talking about violence, and that's kind of as good a place to start as any with this conversation. Dr. Red, if I may, what was the healthcare experience that radicalized you?
Ooh, well, actually, I'm going to go back to the experience that radicalized me into healthcare. What about that?
Yeah, no, it
I
radicalized
am
you. Yeah,
yeah,
it kind of goes the
yeah,
other way.
yeah. I am a survivor of multiple violent losses. My grandparents were killed in a car accident when I was 12 years old. My father was murdered by an Islamic fundamentalist when I was 19. And then my partner of 5 years fell off a ladder at work in September of 2020 in the midst of COVID. And I was his caretaker for 7 months and 2 days. And then he died by witness suicide in our backyard. And so all of that has radicalized me, but certainly my father's death and my experience of grieving after that sent me on this very long journey. I initially started as a naturopath and a yoga teacher, so I have all that juiciness inside me, but eventually during a trip to India, I was in the OR and decided, oh my God, I really want to be a surgeon. And so I started my educational journey all over again and went to medical school, knowing that I wanted to be a surgeon and very interested in trauma. And I was very lucky where I went to medical school. I went to medical school at OHSU in Portland, Oregon. Oregon is the birthplace of initially, used to be called Death with Dignity, and now it's more often referred to as medical aid in dying. And one of the things I was told when I started there was that if you are going to offer a choice as quote unquote radical as medical aid in dying, you need to make sure that your palliative care and your hospice services are top notch as well. And at OHSU, they really took that to heart. And so they had this award winning palliative care team that I got to work with for a month as a fourth year medical student that completely changed my life. And then at OHSU, it was also the birthplace of the post form, which is a living will on steroids. It gets really down into the nitty gritty of what patients want at the end of life. And the beauty of it, it is a physician signed order. So it needs to, unlike sometimes when we have living wills that I have seen many times not be honored because a family member swoops in and says,
Hmm.
oh no, we're not doing that. Post forms, and in every state they're called something slightly different, but they're always on if you're looking for them, they're always on a very bright pink piece of paper. So in Oregon, it's yellow. In North Carolina, where I live, it's hot pink. But those are physician orders that cannot be ignored. And so it's actually really, I think, has changed very slowly the shape of end of life care a little bit. So I was very lucky to train in this amazing environment. And while I knew I wanted to be a surgeon and went to surgical residency, very much knowing I really wanted to be a trauma surgeon, I was so inspired by how my father died. I knew I also wanted to do end of life care. And so after I was done with all of my surgical training, I did a last year of fellowship and did a fellowship in hospice and palliative medicine. And now I feel proud to say I'm one of about 100 surgeons in the entire United States who's also board certified in hospice and palliative care, which to me is really cool.
It's really cool. It's really cool. And the way that you integrate thinking about all of these different paths and also then bringing in yoga and philosophy and how all of these things are related because we tend to stay very in our lanes, I think, in American healthcare. And most of the lanes actually are devoted to keeping you alive at any cost, right?
Right.
And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about that I've certainly experienced in my life, but also very much in my study, and talking to people in healthcare, giving talks to healthcare organizations, is we still tend to think of healthcare in terms of the sick, the sick. And we talk about illness, we talk about sickness, and we don't talk about violence. We
Yeah.
don't talk about injury. We don't talk about suicide. We don't talk about domestic abuse. We don't talk about gun violence as being integral to our healthcare systems and to the way that we live our lives. What is that disconnect? You're in it. You see it. You know that practitioners are working in this field. Why is there still this blind spot?
Really interesting. And it's interesting when we're saying we don't talk about it, but I will tell you, surgeons do talk about it. So, the American College of Surgeons, which is the largest group of surgeons in the country, I think there's like 68,000 members or something like that. These are things we talk about at our meetings. They have a committee on domestic violence. We have a committee on gun violence. One of the leaders in gun violence is like way up, and preventive gun violence is way up in the American College of Surgeons. We talk about these things. Now, why they don't get translated into American healthcare? I think the vast majority of American healthcare is focused on that acute issue. And I always say, I think, and when I'm speaking of American healthcare, I'm really speaking about like Western allopathic medicine, right? Because we have this whole other side of medicine that we don't focus on as much. But I think Western allopathic medicine is really great at saving lives. Like, you come in and we're very good diagnosticians, and we are pretty good at saving your life, often too good at saving your life, one could argue. I think where we fail is we fail to look at, and I learned this when my partner suffered a traumatic brain injury. I trained as a trauma surgeon. Most of my patients, I'd say at least 50% of my patients on any given day are traumatic brain injuries, mostly older people who have ground levels falls, but often also younger people who've had horrible either self-inflicted gunshot wounds or horrible car accidents or motorcycle crashes. What I failed to realize is that all of these injuries are really forms of chronic illness. And what is the American healthcare system really crappy about is taking care of chronic illness, which you kind of know. And so therein lies the problem. I mean, I think, like, when I think of my hospital, we just became a level 1 trauma center. And I think I'm so proud of us. And I think we're really great at saving lives. And I think that our stats look really good that we can get you out of the hospital. But after that, I don't think none of us are that great. And so when I lived with it, my partner lasted for 7 months, and I was like so overwhelmed and terrified by what was going on in his body and his brain every day. And here I am, I was a great advocate for him. He went to, oh my God, I think over almost 200 appointments in those 7 months, when you all the physical therapy, occupational, this, that. And I still didn't feel like he got great care because no one was really able to fully deal with this entire chronic illness in a person who is having issues with all different systems, right? So we're so bad at chronic illness too, because oftentimes they cross systems. So, you'll have an issue with your cardiovascular system and also with your neurologic system, and then you're having GI issues. And like, they just want to send you to a different doctor. So I think that's one of the reasons we really fail.
And those doctors are not in conversation necessarily with each other. And it becomes this escalation of interventions that don't necessarily act well together. I also want to take a moment and say, I want anyone who's listening to this to understand that you can die from falling off a ladder because
A
we
hundred
do it all the
percent.
time and we wildly underestimate how risky it is.
Yeah, I just redid my house and I had like different people on my roof, and I was just like, I cannot even watch this. I never would have thought, like, he fell 10 feet and, it ruined his life to the point
Right.
where he didn't want to be in that body anymore, young, healthy man.
And it is a very common
Yep.
way people get traumatic brain injuries. I want to ask you because you and I kind of met through talking about the Rob Reiner death. And
Yeah.
you obviously, this is still an unfolding conversation. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But you made the point that I think is really key that a lot of us who are outside of these experiences maybe don't understand, don't recognize, which is that violence is a family issue and the impact that violence has well before a violent act or before a homicide, and then the aftermath of it. Talk to me a little bit about what we don't understand, and we need to, because that's something that can happen to any of us at
Yeah.
almost any time. And it's certainly is a story that a lot of us are living very quietly with and not
I,
acknowledging.
I'm often amazed. Like, I just had this conversation again yesterday. When I talk to random people at work, or I'll talk to my patients' families, how often people will share that they too are survivors of violent loss. And so, violent loss is defined as a loss due to homicide, to suicide, to an accident, or to a disaster, whether that's like natural or man made. And this is not about the loss or grief Olympics. Like, every death is grieved in multiple different ways by multiple different people. But I think it is important to recognize that violent loss is its own kind of loss. And why is that? Violent loss also often includes three different things. One, we have the actual loss of the person, but then the survivors of violent loss are often initially dealing with law enforcement and then are often dealing with the media. We can obviously see that in this case. And I certainly saw it, 30 plus years ago when my father was killed. I was living, or my family was living in New Jersey. So I'm like watching New York nightly news, when there was like thrills to two or three stations, like I was watching NBC nightly news and turn on the station and there's my dad's picture that he was murdered by a terrorist. So we have law enforcement, media, and then the legal system, which can go on. The lawsuit my family was involved with was 10 years. So it goes on and on. And I'll tell you, my father's murderer was put to death. He was hung to death 4 years after. In the meantime, he had actually killed a whole group of other people. And we could talk about the death penalty all day. That's not my thing. My thing is I felt no great relief when he died. My dad was still very dead. And so that's like this false belief that people have. Some people really do benefit from justice. Everyone's so different too. But these are all the things that I say make violent death a lot more messy for those that survive it. And there's also that question of legacy too, that I think it's so important to remember that how someone dies does not define how they lived. And like, I say that to myself all the time. I really repeated that a lot after my partner died by suicide. And I tell family members that it's just another chapter. It's often an unfortunate, really messy, scary, terrible one, but it doesn't define a whole life. And we certainly see that in the news now. How could you define a let's man and woman who lived beautiful, creative, gorgeous, love-filled lives like this? This in no way should define their legacy.
Yeah, and it's hard. And I really appreciated in your TED Talk, you talked about the media because it's something that I think a lot of people don't also understand when an act of violence becomes a headline that you can't escape, even if it's not as specific as yours, where it was an ongoing story, but just seeing I'm in the UK now, seeing what that looks like in terms of things, people's faces and lives being splashed all over the press, the way that your story becomes so out of your own control. And then social media on top of that, the aspects of feeling like your grief, this very personal experience, becomes so much about the way that the story is told in public. And you've talked a lot about also the patient stories and about the narrative. And the narrative, it's really hard to get your hands around in a situation like that. Talk to me a little bit, because you've also experienced this, about the aftermath of violence when it's not a death and what
Yeah.
that looks like, because you see it in a way that I was going to say a lot of us don't, but a lot of us, like a lot of us, some of the numbers
Yeah.
about how many of and the percentage of our lives are impacted by violence.
Yeah, this was certainly what led me to comment on your article, is that obviously when we think about violence of any type, we think about death. And obviously that is a very important statistic. But what we don't what's researched, but what's not talked about and really reckoned with by the general public is what we call morbidity. So, what are the after effects of violence on the patient, on the family, and on the community? And so I think about this all the time because obviously all of my patients, my trauma patients, they lived, but what does that look like? And it could look like so many different things. I take care of so many patients who have traumatic brain injuries, and like I shared, I had no idea what that looked like when the patients went home. And sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's really not. And then our patients who are victims of gun violence, I have so many young patients over the years who are paralyzed, either high cervical spine injury, which is like confined to bed, and oftentimes we can't even control your heartbeat without a pacemaker because the spine injury is so high it's affecting your vagus nerve. And a lot of patients who are paraplegic but who are either uninsured or underinsured, and so they can't even get a wheelchair. That, when you have a wheelchair, you should get it refitted every year. They can't even afford an appropriate wheelchair. So then they're sitting in a seat. And so then eventually they get awful sacral decubitus ulcers or bed sores. And then they're in and out of the hospital with that. They're in constant pain. Even if they can't feel me touching them, they have pain in their body. Their autonomic nervous systems are totally dysregulated. And it's hard to pee. It's hard to poop. It's like people don't understand the daily struggle. And again, I always come back to this. I didn't either. This is not something I learned in medical school. I'm sure we had one lecture on it. Not something I really experienced that much in surgical residency. Yeah, I saw some of it in fellowship when I was training, but I've only seen it now because like you see these patients coming in and out of the hospital again and again with these conditions. And it's such a strain on the family as well, because you imagine if you don't have a lot of money, how do you make your house appropriate for someone who's in a wheelchair? I mean, and that's just one episode of violence. And I'll tell you, because I also do emergency general surgery. So we have these patients who come in with bowel obstructions 20 years after they were shot in the belly, these big scars on their belly, and now they're needing surgery for that. So violence is a chronic disease that it's also a lifelong disease. And I'm only talking about the physical. So we can like talk about the mental, the emotional, the spiritual. It just goes on and on. And yeah.
And we don't, there's a couple of things about that. One, and the person who is experiencing this is also going through the legal system, is also dealing with
Yes.
law enforcement, maybe sometimes as a perpetrator. I've seen that in
Oh,
my
yeah.
own emergency department when I've been there with my kids and someone is brought in who is a suspect, but also has knife wounds. That's an unusual healthcare situation. And then we definitely, I don't ever hear, maybe you do more so because you're an actual physician, about the comorbidity of violence and the impact that also has on things like heart disease, like things like cancer, like all of the other stuff that we may get. It's so sectioned off over here that when someone comes in with diabetes or like heart disease, I don't hear conversations from doctors
Right.
about what else has been going on in terms of violence and trauma in these people's lives and the long-term effects that are having. And there's, as far as I can tell, very little research about it in the American healthcare system.
I would agree. I mean, I think there's been some studies over the years following trauma patients, but what I would say is like when you read most of the literature, it's really how to treat the acutely injured trauma patient. And I 100% understand that, because the reality is you have to be really good because you don't know what's coming in. And so you have to be able to really quickly decide what you're going to do and do it well to save someone's life. But yeah, I mean, again, our acute healthcare system, which is where the vast majority of trauma surgeons work, we don't see that after effect at all. I have can I mention one friend who's done amazing work? I
Please.
have a friend, colleague. His name is Dr. LJ Punch. And Dr. Punch started the Bullet Related Injury Clinic and speaks so much about the after effects of gun violence, to the point where, what's fascinating is the dictum in surgical training is really not to remove the bullets. Like we don't go after them because it could really create more trouble than we may think it's worth. But Dr. Punch started talking about, well, how does it feel to hold something in your body that is a reminder of the absolute worst day of your life? So that's from like the mental, emotional, spiritual. Also, sometimes they really cause a lot of pain depending on where they're sitting. And so even that is something that before they started talking about it, I actually had never really thought about it. And I'd also never heard someone suggest, oh, maybe we should be going after these. And again, that's just one little effect of violence.
Right. And that's just one aspect, and particularly because in the American healthcare system, we're dealing with gun violence more than almost any other country in the
Yeah.
world, certainly more than any other of our peer nations by a very wide margin, which brings me to something else I want to talk to you a little bit about
Yeah.
that I've really been studying the past few years. the increasing violence against healthcare workers, that the healthcare system is one of the most violent workplaces you can work in the United States. The percentage of incidents of violence against healthcare workers is through the roof, particularly in emergency and trauma. The ways in which that has escalated since the pandemic, you are not only treating violence, you are also often experiencing it firsthand. What does that look like, and how does that change how practitioners go about their jobs?
Yeah, I will start by saying I've not been a victim of any physical violence. I have been, and I wouldn't call myself a victim. I'm just like casual bystander of a lot of verbal stuff thrown my way. And the way I look at for me, the way I look at the verbal stuff is I am meeting this person, regardless of who it is, on one of the worst days of their lives. And I have often found, and this is just for me, that I will meet them back where they are. Like if they're saying F you, I'm going to say no, F you. And I love you and let me take care of you. And that's my personality, but that can escalate very quickly, particularly when someone is under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or someone is in the midst of some sort of psychiatric illness where they are just not able to control themselves anymore. And so what that ends up looking like is, again, we don't have, in an acute care hospital, we lack a lot of finesse. So what happens when someone's behaving like that is we call in security, who is not, God bless them, but they're not like they're not providing any sort of trauma informed care. They're there to like protect people. And so now we have this patient who is just going to be either overly drugged or tied down and get more and more frustrated. Because if we don't, I mean, I've certainly seen the effects of of violence in general and seen someone get punched and all the things. And it's like, it's heartbreaking because you're just there to provide. You really do. I think everyone just wants to like love these patients, however their love kind of manifests. And instead, we have to protect ourselves first. I'll say this has certainly gotten worse over the last couple of years, and we all know this. Like people don't trust like the healthcare system anymore, and don't trust healthcare providers, and think that we have a lot of nefarious interests. And so I think oftentimes people come in angry, and depending on who you are, I'm not an escalator. I am definitely more like I am going to kill you with kindness, and I am going to love on you and like keep acknowledging how hard this is, and until we can like find some sort of middle ground. But again, in the midst of a violent episode, you can't do that. And then the other thing I want to say, it's not just violence that patients and family members are perpetrating on the healthcare workers, but it's also just working in a violent environment. And what I mean by that is like a couple years ago, we had a like armed, we had an episode where there was supposedly an armed shooter in the building. So, we had to lock down all these units. We have to lock down, and this happens at all trauma centers. We have to lock down the hospital, especially the emergency department, when we bring a victim of gun violence in, because we don't know who's going to be following them in or looking to finish the job. So it's like a very heightened sense of lack of safety in the workplace. And I had an incident a couple weeks ago where I was in the midst of like I was working on emergency general surgery at night, and it was like just having a rough time in the middle of a case, and then the charge nurse walks in and she's like, we have a mass casualty coming. That's number one. Oh, number two, the killer's on the loose and they have no idea where they are. So, I have a lot of different things going on there. One, I'm like just frustrated in the middle of surgery. Two, as a survivor of violent loss, I'm like I don't feel safe, And then three, it's like that reality of like, well, you have this job to do, and like I just have to take a breath and keep going. But it's like, how is one supposed? And this is in a rather large community hospital, but in a community hospital in Western North Carolina, like in this town,
Right,
So it's not like in the middle of a big city.
right.
That's what I think we're all dealing with throughout the United States.
Right. And I think I just want to say, those of us who have ever been on the other side of it, maybe you've fallen ice skating, which has happened to me, and you wind up in that emergency department, and you may be next to someone who has experienced violence, who has perpetuated violence. You may, as you said, someone may be coming in after looking for somebody.
Yeah.
It impacts all of our lives as practitioners and as patients. I think there is so much silence around the violence that a lot of us have experienced or witnessed because there's so much shame. You talked about it in your TED talk about the shame around violence, the feeling of maybe I didn't do enough, maybe I did the wrong thing. And I really am so grateful to you because you're talking about these
Mm,
things and you're taking them out of the darkness, saying this is what violence really looks like. I remember after Sandy Hook, someone said, if you knew what those guns did to those
yeah,
children's bodies. And now I live in an America where I'm like, I don't know if that would even be enough, but we don't think about it. We don't
right.
think about the actual visceral reality of violence until we are confronted with it. And
Yeah, it's
even
ugly
then,
and messy.
right. It's messy. And it,
Mhm.
as you said, it is a long-term, often chronic experience for a lot of people that our insurance systems aren't prepared to deal with. But I really am glad that we are able to just at least have conversations about it. And you're such a huge part of it. You are the person I was looking for, Dr. Red. So I'm so glad I found you.
Well, I'm so glad I was sitting in my bathtub reading your Substack.
Okay. You know what? That's where I want people to be reading it. Just like chilling, get the
Yep.
essential oils coming up. That's what I want. Dr. Red, Dr. Melissa Red Hoffman, thank you so much. I'm going to link to your TED Talk and some of your beautiful writing about the things you've been through and what it feels like from the inside. I'm so grateful to you for talking about this stuff and keep talking about it. And we're going to keep listening. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you so much. I appreciate you so much for having me. It's great chatting with you and so great to meet you.